"You don't belong here anymore. This is our home now." That was the moment Claire realized Melissa wasn't just her father's new wife. She was a quiet invader taking over piece by piece. It started with the living room where her mother's paintings disappeared overnight. Then the garden. Her mother's rose trellises bulldozed to make room for a koi pond. But when Claire came home from work one day, to find her childhood bedroom replaced by yoga mats and scented candles, she didn't cry or scream. She smiled, because what Melissa didn't know was that Claire never fights on the battlefield. She wins in the shadows. If you've ever watched someone try to rewrite your family's legacy, hit that like button, subscribe for more, and let us know what would you have done in Claire's shoes. Claire was a strategist by profession and by nature. At 33, she'd built a respected career as a financial risk analyst in New York, known for her precision, her logic, and her ability to see 3 moves ahead. But nothing in her line of work prepared her for the silent takeover of her own family home. A year after Claire's mother passed from a sudden illness, her father remarried a woman named Melissa. On paper, Melissa was perfect. Elegant, emotionally intelligent, and surprisingly well-read in estate planning. Too well-read, Claire would later think. She returned home for a long visit, hoping to reconnect with her father, but what she found was a house stripped of her mother's essence. Melissa had charmed the staff, reorganized the family finances, and positioned herself as the loving caregiver, urging her husband to slow down and prioritize peace. To outsiders, Melissa was a godsend. To Claire, she was a smiling storm with perfect nails and a 5-step plan for taking everything that wasn't hers. And so she did what she did best. She watched, she waited, and she began collecting evidence. But it wasn't until Melissa tried to cut Claire out of her own legacy that the first real counterstrike was set in motion. Claire hadn't always been the cool, calculated woman who could dissect financial fraud over a cup of coffee. She'd learned early that emotions didn't get you what you wanted, facts did. And that lesson had started at home. Growing up, Claire was the quiet daughter, not rebellious enough to demand attention like her cousins, not fragile enough to be doted on like the neighbors' kids. She was always capable, efficient, the kind of child who didn't need reminding to do her homework or pack her lunch. And because of that, she often disappeared in her own family's eyes. Her mother, Elaine, had been her anchor. An artist with calloused hands and soft eyes, Elaine taught Claire how to see patterns where others saw chaos, how to read people by what they choose to hide. But her father, Richard, was a different story. A successful businessman, stern and results-driven, he loved Claire in his own way. But he loved control more. Emotions made him uncomfortable. Vulnerability felt like weakness. And when Claire chose finance over fine arts in college, he called it practical, not realizing it was also a subtle rebellion. She wanted to beat him at his own game. Claire spent most of her 20s proving herself. Ivy League MBA, a risk analyst position that fast-tracked her into executive circles. While her peers were still climbing, she was already sitting on audit committees and reading quarterly reports like bedtime stories. But no matter how many promotions or bonuses she racked up, Richard never once said, "I'm proud of you." At best, he'd offer a stiff nod. At worst, silence. Then came her mother's sudden passing pancreatic cancer, fast and cruel. Claire took a leave from work to be with her in the final weeks. They talked about everything art, legacy regrets. But even on her deathbed, Elaine whispered, "Take care of your father. He means well even if he doesn't show it." Claire tried. She really did. But Richard spiraled. He sold Elaine's gallery within a month, cancelled all her museum memberships, boxed up her studio without a word. And then within the year, he introduced Melissa. Melissa, with her impeccable timing, moving into the estate just as Claire was easing back into her own life. Claire had only met her once before the wedding, a brief brunch, where Melissa had praised Elaine's taste and quoted philosophers over mimosas. Something about her seemed too polished, too curated. But Claire had learned to keep suspicions to herself, until the signs became impossible to ignore. The first red flag, her mother's favorite piano, was gone. It didn't match the new aesthetic, Melissa said with a laugh. Then came the redecoration, the removal of family photos, the sudden appearance of luxury wellness brands, Melissa's consulting clients apparently taking up storage in the guest house. Claire returned for what she thought would be a short holiday visit, and found her bedroom replaced with a minimalist yoga retreat, complete with a water feature and energy crystals. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. But something inside her hardened. At dinner that night, Melissa offhandedly mentioned Richard was considering early retirement and had been thinking of simplifying the trust structure. Claire's fork froze mid-air. She knew that language, knew the cadence. This wasn't just a trophy wife playing house. This was a woman slowly restructuring power, and her father, half absent and desperate for peace, was letting it happen. That night, Claire went to the attic. She found her mother's safe still locked, still untouched, and retrieved what Melissa had overlooked: the original estate documents, joint ownership contracts, even Elaine's personal letters. She didn't read them all right away, just scanned, filed, and stored. It became a ritual. Each visit, Claire played the long game, kind smiles, polite conversation, careful listening. But in the background, she was downloading financial reports, photographing suspicious mail, and quietly consulting legal contacts at her firm. She enlisted the help of her old roommate, Gina, a digital forensic specialist, who helped her track online activity tied to Melissa's LLCs. Offshore accounts, overlapping addresses, hidden purchases. Melissa had done this before. Claire found 2 ex-husbands, one bankrupt, one hospitalized after a freak accident during a property transfer dispute. Both described the same pattern: seduction, consolidation, isolation, and eventual takeover. Claire compiled it all and waited. But tension at the estate was growing. Melissa became increasingly bold. She began selling heirlooms, passing them off as donations. Staff were quietly replaced. Richard's longtime lawyer stopped returning calls. Then came the ultimate insult. Melissa served Claire with a gentle suggestion to vacate the property, as it was now reserved for immediate family. Claire didn't argue. She left that day without a word, but she took everything she needed with her. And as Melissa celebrated her victory, Claire was already setting the stage for a takedown so thorough it would dismantle everything Melissa had built, one document at a time. Claire moved moved into a sleek, sparsely furnished apartment in Manhattan, far from the warmth of the estate, but right in the heart of her element. It was a controlled space, quiet and meticulously organized. While Melissa celebrated her new domain back at the estate, Claire sat behind multiple screens cross-referencing asset transfers, cash flows, and names connected to Melissa's ever-growing financial spiderweb. Gina, her old college roommate and digital forensics expert, was already deep into decrypting metadata from a set of thumb drives Claire had borrowed from the estate office printer. On those drives were scanned copies of Richard's signature on a series of suspicious trust modifications, many of which were created just days after he was reportedly sedated for a minor surgery. The timestamps didn't lie. Claire knew her father might not have even realized what he'd signed, but the real turning point came during a Wednesday morning call with her firm's legal team. They had quietly contacted a former business associate of Melissa's second husband, Victor Langston, a retired vineyard owner in Napa. His testimony turned everything on its head. Victor wasn't just a man who had lost everything, he was nearly institutionalized after Melissa convinced his doctors he was suffering early-stage dementia. Claire listened stunned as the man described the same behavioral patterns, the same manipulations. Melissa had even used yoga and spiritual wellness as a cover in that case, too. Claire's blood ran cold. She flew to Napa 2 days later and met Victor in person. What she got wasn't just a story. It was a trail of documentation, notarized statements, property records, and most damning of all, a voice recording from 10 years ago of Melissa laughing to someone on the phone, saying, "Men are so easy. Just give them peace, silence, and let them think it's their idea." Claire returned to New York with everything she needed. But she wasn't planning to go public just yet. No, Melissa was far too careful, too poised. Any sign of a threat, and she'd vanish just like before. So Claire turned the screw slowly. She began by calling her father, not with accusations, but with concern. She asked how he was feeling, asked about his health. When he mentioned trouble remembering certain documents Melissa had him sign, Claire gently offered to look into it with one of her contacts. She kept her tone neutral, respectful. It was the first time Richard hadn't shut down in a conversation for months. Over the next few weeks, she visited more often, always alone, always calm. She brought financial summaries, old photos, even her mother's handwritten letters. Slowly, cracks began to form. Her father stopped speaking about Melissa with the same confidence. He began asking questions. That's when Melissa slipped. She hosted a fundraiser at the estate, one Claire wasn't invited to, and invited a list of high-net-worth individuals using the family name to endorse a wellness non-profit Claire had never heard of. But Claire's firm had, because that same non-profit had appeared in a recent flagged transaction list, a shell organization moving money through 4 countries in under 48 hours. This was the moment Claire had been waiting for. She activated the trap. Using the full backing of her firm's compliance team, Claire submitted a quiet report to the Treasury Department under the Bank Secrecy Act. At the same time, Gina released a digital drop of Melissa's linked accounts aliases and the Victor Langston testimony to a discreet family law attorney, someone Claire had been grooming for months to handle a potential emergency injunction. Then, in a stroke of poetic justice, Claire attended one final dinner at the estate, It was supposed to be casual. Melissa greeted her with that familiar, too smooth smile. Richard was quieter than usual, sipping wine and talking about a new trip to Portugal. Melissa wanted to plan for relaxation. Claire nodded politely, waited for dessert to be served, then opened her briefcase. She laid out the documents, photos, timelines, testimonies, and most critically a recording from a call Melissa had made just a week prior, where she bragged to an offshore broker, "He still thinks the foundation is for his late wife. Let him believe that." Richard's hands shook as he listened. He turned ghost pale. For a full minute the room was silent, except for the sound of his glass settling unevenly on the polished oak table. Then he stood up. No shouting, no drama, just a single sentence. "Melissa, you need to leave this house. Now." The next 48 hours were a whirlwind. Lawyers arrived. A restraining order was filed. Financial authorities began their inquiries. Melissa's world unraveled in real time. Her private accounts were frozen. Her nonprofit was flagged for investigation, and her silent confidence was replaced with rage and disbelief as she was served legal papers in her yoga robe in the very garden she'd built over Claire's mother's roses. But Claire wasn't there for that part. She'd already left quietly, just like before. Except this time, she wasn't retreating. She was done watching from the shadows, and as Melissa's empire collapsed around her, Claire faced the hardest part of all, helping her father reckon with what he had allowed, and deciding what forgiveness should really look like. Claire sat in her apartment, lights off, blinds drawn, watching the final pieces fall into place from the glow of her laptop screen. It should have felt like victory. She had everything she ever needed, proof legal, wins even moral clarity. But instead of relief, a knot twisted deep in her stomach. Because this wasn't just a takedown. This was her father, and now there was nothing left to protect him from the truth. 2 days after Melissa was served and quietly escorted from the estate by legal counsel, Claire returned not with a hard drive or a dossier, but with 2 cups of coffee and a folder of old family photos. She found her father alone in the sunroom, staring blankly out over the trimmed hedges. The man looked 10 years older than he had just weeks ago. The lines on his face seemed deeper, his shoulders sagging not from age, but from something heavier, shame. He didn't say hello, didn't stand, just gave her a small nod and murmured, "You were right." Claire sat opposite him and waited. She didn't need to press. The silence between them had always said more than words. "I knew she wasn't like your mother," he continued almost to himself. "But I wanted peace. I wanted someone to fill the space. I ignored things I shouldn't have." His voice cracked. "I let her erase your mother, and I let her push you out." Claire didn't speak. Not yet. "I was supposed to protect this family," he said, and now his eyes finally met hers. "But you protected me." That broke something in her. Tears welled up uninvited, stinging. She looked away quickly, masking the emotion with a sip of coffee. All her life, she had built herself into someone untouchable, strategic, unshakable. And now, here she was undone by 5 simple words. "You protected me." Because that's what she had always wanted. Not money, not recognition, just to matter. Just for him to see her. They sat in silence for a while. Two people bruised by the same betrayal, navigating a battlefield where the enemy was gone, but the damage remained. "I read her emails," he said after a long pause. "She laughed at you, called you the cold one, said you'd never figure it out." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Guess she underestimated cold." Richard gave a hollow laugh, one that ended in a sigh. But then the conversation shifted. Slowly, gently, Richard began asking questions not about the legal aftermath, but about Elaine, about her mother, what she had said in those final days, what she had meant by asking Claire to take care of him. "She always said I couldn't read people," he admitted. Claire smiled faintly. She was right. Richard turned toward her. "But you can." And in that moment, Claire realized something else. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about healing. It wasn't enough to burn down Melissa's lies. They had to rebuild something in its place. Something real. But healing required confrontation, and that would come sooner than expected. 3 days later, Melissa returned to the estate. Illegally. She drove up in a rented SUV, wearing oversized sunglasses and a white linen dress, as if nothing had happened. Claire had been there meeting with the estate's new legal team when the staff buzzed her phone. "Miss Claire, she's back." Claire stepped outside as Melissa was stepping out of the car. They faced each other for the first time since everything fell apart. Melissa smiled as smooth and venomous as ever. "This isn't over, Claire," she said. "You think you've won, but men always crawl back to what makes them feel good. Your father isn't yours to manipulate anymore." Claire cut in voice, steel cold. Melissa's smile faltered just slightly. Claire took a step forward. "You underestimated the daughter. You played the long game, but I play the forever game. Everything you touched is tainted, documented, and under review. And if you even think about stepping foot near him again, I'll make sure your next yoga retreat happens behind bars." Melissa's lips curled. "You're just like her, you know. Cold. Obsessed with control." Claire nodded. "Good. She was the strongest person I've ever known." Then she turned and walked away. Not because Melissa wasn't worth the fight, but because the fight was already won. Back inside, Claire found her father standing near the staircase, his face pale. He had heard it all. He opened his mouth to speak, but Claire shook her head. "You don't owe me anything, Dad. Not anymore. Just don't let anyone write over Mom again." "I won't," he said softly. And that's when Claire knew this wasn't the end of a chapter. It was the beginning of a new one. A fragile rebuilding brick by brick, where honesty had finally found its place. But before that could happen, there was one more decision she needed to make, one that would define not just her healing, but the legacy she'd leave behind. Because when the dust settled, Claire realized that closure wasn't enough. What she really wanted was to turn her pain into power. 2 weeks after Melissa was legally removed, and Richard began transferring power of attorney to a new trustee, Claire did something she hadn't done since college. She took a break. She turned off her work phone, forwarded all firm-related emails to her deputy, and drove upstate to a quiet cabin once owned by her mother's cousin. No Wi-Fi, no distractions, just trees, a wood stove, and a kitchen stocked with tea and old family cookbooks. It wasn't her usual kind of retreat, but that was the point. She needed stillness, not silence. Her mind would never allow that, but space to feel what came next. For days she read. Journals her mother had written in her final year. Letters Claire had never opened. She cried, of course. More than she expected. And with each page she saw the woman who had always stayed calm, under fire, always made room for the feelings Claire herself had pushed aside for years. Claire began to understand something. Being strategic didn't mean being cold. Her mother hadn't been strong in spite of her softness, she was strong because of it. The tenderness, the patience, the empathy. Those were survival skills too, just a different kind. It was a jarring realization. For most of her adult life, Claire had worn detachment like armor. She'd succeeded in rooms full of men twice her age, because she never let her emotions speak first. But now she wondered had that armor also kept her from healing. Then came a visit that shifted everything. Gina showed up one Sunday afternoon with a backpack full of groceries and a bottle of wine. I figured you were either meditating or spiraling. I brought supplies for both. Claire laughed. The sound felt foreign but good. Over dinner, they talked about everything. About the fallout. The legal back and forth. Her father's quiet guilt. Melissa's radio silence, which was unnerving in its own way. And then Gina said something Claire hadn't expected. You know you could build something from this. Not just legally, socially. Claire raised an eyebrow. I'm serious, Gina continued. You've got the data, the documentation, the real-world case. Do you know how many families get scammed by spouses or wellness consultants or shady caretakers? You could educate people. Create a system of early warnings. Maybe even prevent what happened to you from happening to someone else. Claire leaned back in her chair, letting the idea wash over her. She had planned to return to her job soon, back to crunching risk models and advising Fortune 100 boards. But the work felt small now. Disconnected. Safe, yes, but sterile. What Gina was suggesting wasn't strategy. It was impact. That night, Claire stayed up sketching ideas on paper napkins. A digital platform for vulnerable family members. An educational foundation with real-life case studies. A hotline, backed by legal and financial experts. She even mapped out how trust documents could be safeguarded with blockchain, not because it was trendy, but because it was incorruptible. By morning, she had a plan. But first, she needed closure. She drove back to the estate, not for business, but to speak to her father one last time before moving forward. He was in the study looking through a photo album Claire had reorganized for him, one that restored her mother's presence to the house. Elaine smiling at her wedding, holding baby Claire in the garden, standing in the kitchen with flour on her cheek. Claire sat beside him. I'm not coming back to the firm, she said softly. Richard looked at her surprised. You're quitting? No. I'm pivoting, she replied. There's work I need to do. Not for companies. For people like us. Like Mom. Richard nodded slowly. She'd be proud of you. Claire smiled. I want to build something that honors her. Not just a name on a plaque, but something that keeps people safe. There was a long pause. Then Richard said, Let me help. Claire looked at him startled. I've been retired for almost a year now, and I've done nothing but sign things I didn't understand. Maybe it's time I use my name for something that actually matters. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a real one. A start. Later that week, Claire formally filed the paperwork, the Elaine Foundation for Financial Advocacy and Survivor Protection. She kept the name simple on purpose. Clear. Accessible. Like her mother. The board would include Gina, a former judge, 2 survivors of elder fraud, and in time, Claire's father, once he was ready. She would no longer be the daughter who quaintly kept the family books, while others made the messes. She was now the strategist who used her skills not to punish, but to protect. And that was a choice she made, not from vengeance, but from love. As Claire set her plan into motion, the world around her began to shift. And the legacy she was building soon brought consequences that tested everything she thought she'd healed from. Claire didn't wait for headlines or applause. She launched the Elaine Foundation with quiet precision press releases, to elder advocacy groups' meetings with state officials and early collaboration with cybersecurity teams already battling financial predators. Within weeks, the foundation had over 1,000 inquiries, and Claire was invited to speak at a Senate subcommittee on financial exploitation in families. But behind the scenes, she was executing her final move, one Melissa never saw coming. Using the evidence gathered and contacts across multiple jurisdictions, Claire triggered investigations into Melissa's prior marriages. The digital trail revealed a pattern of manipulation, fake wellness programs, fraudulent trust setups, and offshore shell companies registered under alias names. Claire had already frozen the remaining assets tied to her father's estate, but now Melissa's past came knocking. In Florida, a man who had lost his pension to Timmy, Whitmore's holistic investment plan was reopening his case, backed by Claire's forensic documentation. In California, a widow discovered that Melissa had once offered to help manage her late husband's pension before vanishing with $300K. When Melissa was served a multi-state subpoena, it made national legal news. But more satisfying than the press was the look on the faces of those who once doubted Claire, especially her father's former attorney, who had once dismissed her concerns as overreaction. Now he stood awkwardly in the courthouse corridor, watching Claire brief 2 reporters and a state official, like a seasoned professional. "You're not what I expected," he murmured as she passed. Claire didn't even glance his way. That's the point. Justice wasn't loud. It was methodical, clean, and irreversible. Just like Claire. And for the first time in her life, Claire felt the scales balance not just for her, but for everyone like her. Everyone who had been dismissed, undermined, or gaslit by people hiding behind marriage certificates or fake kindness. Melissa's empire crumbled not with a bang, but with a spreadsheet. But even after justice was served, Claire knew her journey wasn't over, because the final chapter wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about legacy. Claire didn't return to her old life because she'd outgrown it. Instead, she built a new one, rooted in clarity, purpose, and peace. The Elaine Foundation thrived, helping thousands of families spot red flags, secure their assets, and reclaim power they didn't know they had. Claire moved into a sunlit townhouse near the lake, surrounded by quiet. not silence. A place where she could think without armor. Her relationship with her father didn't magically heal overnight, but they were rebuilding one honest conversation at a time. And for the first time since her mother's death, the house felt less like a memory and more like a home. Claire had learned that boundaries weren't walls. They were acts of self-respect. That love without awareness could be dangerous. And that silence in the face of injustice was never neutral. It was complicit. She didn't seek revenge. She sought truth. And from that truth, she built freedom not just for herself, but for others who once felt powerless. Because healing isn't about forgetting. It's about seeing clearly, choosing wisely, and never shrinking for the comfort of others again. If this story resonated with you, share it, or tell yours. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like Claire's, where justice meets healing.